unraveling messianic narratives in Arrakis and beyond, gentle analysis, and sleep draft to hello, my dear. It's Emma. Come in. Settle down. Let the day fall away from your shoulders like sand through open fingers. I've been thinking about deserts tonight, about the way sand holds heat long after the sun has gone, about the way silence can feel like a presence, like something with weight, pressing gently against your chest. There's a story I want to share with you. A story about a young man who walked into a desert and became something he never meant to be. A story about prophecy and belief and the terrible weight of being needed by too many people. But we're not going to rush. We never rush here. We're going to let the story settle over us like dusk settling over dunes. We're going to sink into it slowly, the way you sink into a warm bed at the end of a long day. So breathe. Let your eyes close if they want to. And let me take you to Arrakis. Arrakis is a world of sand. Endless, rolling, ancient sand. The kind of landscape that makes you feel small. The kind of silence that makes you feel held. The people who live there, the Fremen, learned long ago to move with the desert rather than against it. They learned that survival means surrender. Not weakness, never weakness, but the wisdom to know when the land is stronger than you are, when fighting only exhausts you, when the only way forward is to let the current carry you. My mother understood that kind of wisdom. She was a carpenter, and she used to say that a good carpenter doesn't fight the wood. She listens to it. She finds the grain and works with it, not against it. She lets the material teach her what it wants to become. She built the desk I sit at now, the one near the window where I can hear the ocean. She chose the wood carefully, let it season, learned its tendencies before she ever touched a saw to it. And when she was done, the desk felt like it had always existed, like it had been waiting to become itself. I wonder sometimes if Paul Atreides ever felt that way, like he had been waiting to become himself, or if he felt, instead, like the wood shaped by hands he couldn't see, carved into something he never chose to be. Because Paul was born into a story that was already being written. His mother, Jessica, belonged to an ancient sisterhood of women who had spent generations planting seeds. Not in soil, but in minds. They scattered prophecies across distant worlds the way a farmer scatters grain, knowing that someday, somewhere, those seeds would grow into something they could use. On Arrakis, they planted the story of a Messiah, a figure who would come from beyond the desert, a voice from the outer world who would lead the Fremen to paradise. The Fremen didn't know the prophecy had been planted. To them, it was ancient, sacred. true in the way that old stories become true, not because someone proved them, but because generations believed them, because grandmothers whispered them to children, because the words had worn smooth with repetition, like stones in a riverbed, until they felt like they had always been there. And when Paul arrived on Arrakis, fleeing the destruction of his family, stumbling into the desert with nothing but his mother and his grief, the Fremen looked at him and saw the shape of their oldest hope. Imagine standing in a room you've never seen before, but the room knows you. The furniture is arranged for your height. The books on the shelves are books you love. The light falls exactly the way you prefer it. You didn't build this room. You didn't choose any of it, but it fits you perfectly. Too perfectly. And slowly you realize someone built this room for you. Someone who knew you before you knew yourself. Someone who shaped this space so that you would feel at home, so that you would stay, so that you would become what they needed you to become. That's what it felt like for Paul. The prophecies fit him like a room built for his exact dimensions. The Fremen's hope wrapped around him like a garment sewn to his measurements. He could see the stitching. He could see where the seams had been hidden. But the garment fit so well, and the Fremen needed so badly to believe, and the desert was so vast and so indifferent to his doubts. My father used to show me his illustrations before they were finished. Watercolors for children's books, still wet, still becoming. He would ask me how they made me feel. Not whether they were good or bad, he never asked that. Just how they made me feel. And I learned, watching the colors bleed into each other on the page, that stories are made by people, that the feelings they create are chosen, crafted, placed there on purpose. A shadow here to create unease, a warm color there to create comfort. Nothing accidental, everything designed. Paul learned this too, but in a darker way. He learned that the hope of the Fremen had been designed, that their faith had been engineered by women who would never meet them, for purposes they would never understand. And yet the hope was real. The faith was real. The Fremen's longing for deliverance was as genuine as any feeling can be. Can a story be both manufactured and true? Can a prophecy be planted and still take root in something real? I don't know. But I think Paul spent his whole life caught between those questions, unable to answer them, unable to escape them. Like a man standing in a doorway, belonging fully to neither room. The old stories are full of figures like Paul, men called out of ordinary life into something vast and terrifying. Men who didn't want the burden but couldn't set it down. Moses was one of them, born during a time of oppression when his people were slaves and their children were being killed. He was hidden in a basket, set adrift on a river, found by a princess, and raised in a palace. He had every privilege, every comfort. And then one day he saw his people suffering, and something broke open inside him. He killed a man. He fled into the desert. And in the silence and the heat and the emptiness, something spoke to him. A voice from a burning bush. A call he didn't want to answer. Moses resisted. He said he wasn't eloquent. He said the people wouldn't believe him. He begged to be released from the burden of being chosen. But the voice insisted, and Moses went. Jonah was another. Called to preach to a city he despised, he boarded a ship sailing in the opposite direction. He ran from his purpose the way you might run from a wave, knowing even as you run that the water is faster than you are. A storm rose. The sailors threw him overboard, and a great fish swallowed him whole. 3 days in the belly of darkness, 3 days of surrender, and when the fish finally released him onto dry land, Jonah went where he had been told to go. Not because he wanted to, because he had learned that some currents are stronger than the will to resist them. Paul knew that feeling. The feeling of being swallowed by something vast. The feeling of struggling in the dark, fighting against walls that give but don't break. He could see the future, not perfectly, not completely, but enough. He could see the violence that would follow his rise, the wars fought in his name, the blood spilled by people who believed in him too completely. And he looked for another way. He searched the branching paths of possibility, looking for one that didn't lead to fire, looking for a door that opened onto something gentler. But every path curved back to the same place. Every door opened onto the same room, the room that had been built for him, the room he couldn't escape. There's a feeling I want you to hold in your mind, the feeling of walking a path where the walls are already closing in. You can see the walls. You can feel them narrowing. You know that soon there will be no room to turn around, no space to choose a different direction. But you keep walking anyway, because standing still won't stop the walls from closing, because the only way out is through. That's what prescience felt like for Paul. The ability to see the future didn't free him. It showed him the shape of his cage. It let him watch the walls closing in slow motion, with perfect clarity, unable to stop them. Some people think that knowing the future would be a gift, that if we could see what was coming, we could prepare, we could change course, we could avoid our mistakes. But Paul's story whispers something different. Knowing the future can be its own kind of prison. The more clearly you see where you're going, the less freedom you have to go somewhere else. The walls become visible, and visibility doesn't make them less solid. The Fremen called him Muad'Dib. It was the name of a small desert mouse, a creature that survives where nothing should survive, that finds water in the driest places, shelter in the most exposed terrain. Paul took this name because it was humble, because it connected him to the desert, to the Fremen, to their struggle for survival. But names have weight. Names carry expectations. And once the Fremen called him Muad'Dib, once they saw him as the fulfillment of their oldest hopes, the name became heavier than any crown, heavier than gold, heavier than the sand that stretched in every direction, endless and patient and waiting. I think about the weight of names sometimes, the way we grow into the names we're given, the way a name can feel like a promise you never made but are expected to keep. My name is Emma. It means whole or universal. I don't know if my parents chose it for that meaning, or if they just liked the sound of it, the way it felt in their mouths. But I've grown into it. I've tried to be whole. I've tried to offer something universal of voice that anyone can rest in, a presence that doesn't demand anything except your willingness to be here. Paul's name demanded everything. It demanded his freedom, his peace, his future. It demanded that he become what the Fremen needed, regardless of what he wanted for himself. And he became it, not because he chose to, but because some currents are stronger than choice. The water of life was a poison, a substance so toxic that it killed anyone who drank it. But the Fremen believed that their Messiah would be able to transform it, to take death into himself and transmute it into something else, to prove through survival that he was what they hoped he was. Paul drank it. He nearly died. For days he lay unconscious, his body fighting the poison, his mind lost in visions that stretched backward and forward through time. His mother watched over him. Chani watched over him. The Fremen waited, breath held, hope suspended like dust in still air. And when he woke, he was changed. The last barriers in his mind had fallen. He could see everything now, the full scope of time, the branching paths of possibility, the terrible weight of what was coming. He woke into certainty. And certainty, I think, is its own kind of death. The death of hope that things might be different. The death of the small, precious doubt that maybe, just maybe, there's another way. Chani was there when he opened his eyes. She had known him before any of this. She had seen him stumble in the sand, struggle with the stillsuit, make mistakes that any outsider would make. She had watched him become something more than human, and she had loved him anyway. Not the myth, not the prophecy. The man underneath, the one who still doubted, still feared, still reached for her in the night when the visions became too heavy to carry alone. That kind of love is rare. The kind that sees through the role to the person beneath. The kind that doesn't need you to be anything other than what you are. With Chani, Paul could set down the weight of being Muad'Dib. He could be uncertain. He could be afraid. He could be the boy who had lost his father, the young man who didn't know if he was strong enough for what was being asked of him. I hope you have someone who sees you that way. Someone who knows you beneath your roles and responsibilities. Someone with whom you can set down the weight you carry and just breathe. And if you don't have that yet, I hope you find it. I hope you find a place where you can rest. A person, a room, a voice in the darkness that asks nothing of you except your presence. Paul had to marry someone else. The politics of empire demanded it. Her name was Irulan, and she was the emperor's daughter, and their union was the price of peace. Not love. There was no love between them. Just duty and history and the terrible arithmetic of power. Imagine a garment made of lead, heavy enough that every step requires effort, heavy enough that sitting down feels like relief and standing up feels like battle. The throne was that garment for Paul, and Irulan was woven into its fabric, not because she was cruel, not because she demanded anything, but because she represented everything he had to carry. The expectations of the great houses, the traditions of the old empire, the endless, exhausting performance of being what everyone needed him to be. Chani remained his heart, but Irulan was his crown, and crowns, even golden ones, press down on the head that wears them. They leave marks that don't fade. Irulan lived in the silence of the palace, surrounded by luxury, emptied of love. She wrote histories of Paul, trying to understand the man she had married but never known. She filled books with words about him, and the words were true, and they captured nothing. Because how do you capture a man who has become a symbol? How do you write the history of someone who exists more in other people's hopes than in his own heart? I think about Irulan sometimes with a kind of quiet sadness. She was used, the way Paul was used, the way the Fremen were used. Pieces on a board, moved by hands they couldn't see. She didn't choose her fate any more than Paul chose his. She just wore it day after day, the lead garment of duty pressing down on her shoulders. The sandworms of Arrakis were vast, ancient, terrifying, and sacred. The Fremen called them Shai-Hulud and worshipped them as manifestations of God. They moved through the sand like living earthquakes, swallowing everything in their path, creating the spice that made the universe run. Paul learned to ride them. It was a rite of passage among the Fremen to summon a worm, to mount its ridged back, to direct its vast power toward your destination. A single human figure on something immense and ancient, directing it, yes, but never truly controlling it. Always aware that the power beneath you is not yours, that you're borrowing it, channeling it, riding it toward a destination you hope you've chosen. That's what being a Messiah felt like for Paul, riding something vast and ancient, the belief of millions, the momentum of prophecy, the terrible, beautiful, unstoppable power of hope. He could lean into the turns, shift the weight, nudge the great beast toward one path rather than another. But he couldn't stop it. He couldn't get off. He could only ride and hope and try to steer toward the least terrible destination. The Jihad came anyway. The holy war he had foreseen, the violence he had tried to prevent it, swept across the galaxy like fire across dry grass. Billions died. Worlds were remade. His name became a battle cry, a prayer, a curse. Everything he had feared, everything he had seen in his visions, unfolded exactly as he knew it would. And Paul grew tired, tired of seeing, tired of knowing, tired of carrying the weight of a future he couldn't change. The prescience that had once felt like power now felt like chains. Every moment was shadowed by the moments to come. Every joy was dimmed by the knowledge of sorrows approaching. There's a phrase that echoes through the story: Paul's terrible purpose. It sounds violent, aggressive, sharp-edged, and in its consequences, it was. But I don't think the purpose felt violent to Paul. I think it felt like a tide. Have you ever been caught in a current? The way the water pulls you gently at first, then with increasing insistence. The way you realize that swimming against it is exhausting, and swimming with it is surrender, and there's no third option. Paul's terrible purpose was like that. A tide pulling him out to sea. He could struggle against it. He could exhaust himself fighting. But the water was stronger than he was, and eventually he had to let it carry him. Not because he wanted to, because the alternative was drowning in the fight. I think about surrender often. Not the surrender of defeat, but the surrender of acceptance. The moment when you stop fighting what you cannot change and start finding peace within it. My mother knew that surrender. She worked with the wood, not against it. The Fremen knew it too. They moved with the desert, not against it. They found life in the harshest places by accepting the harshness, by letting it shape them instead of breaking against it. Paul never quite found that peace. The tide carried him, but he never stopped grieving for the shore he'd left behind. He never stopped wishing he could have been someone else, somewhere else, free of the current that pulled him toward a destination he hadn't chosen. In the end, he walked into the desert. Blind now, his prescience fading like light at dusk, he followed the Fremen tradition for those who could no longer see. He walked into the sand and didn't come back. Some say he died out there, swallowed by the desert that had made him. Some say he found peace at last, freed from the burden of vision, freed from the weight of being believed in. Some say he's still walking, somewhere beyond the dunes, finally just a man. Finally, no one's Messiah. Finally able to rest. I like to think the desert gave him something in return for everything it had taken. Silence, stillness, the freedom to be no one at all, the freedom to stop carrying the hopes of millions and just feel the sand beneath his feet, the heat on his skin, the vast, indifferent sky above him. The Fremen say the desert takes and the desert gives. It took Paul's father, his home, his freedom, his peace. Maybe, in the end, it gave him the only thing he ever really wanted: the chance to disappear, the chance to stop being a symbol and become, at last, just another grain of sand in the endless, rolling, ancient dunes. I've been speaking for a while now, and the night has grown deep around us. The story of Paul Atreides is heavy with prophecy and violence and the weight of impossible choices. But I hope it hasn't felt heavy in a bad way. I hope it's felt heavy like a warm blanket, heavy like the pressure of sleep pressing gently on your eyelids, heavy like the tide pulling you softly out to sea, because that's what I wanted to give you tonight. Not answers. I don't have answers. Just wait. Just the slow, settling weight of a story that takes itself seriously. A story that doesn't rush, doesn't demand, doesn't ask anything of you except your willingness to sink into it. The spice must flow, they said on Arrakis. The spice must flow because the universe depended on it, because empires rose and fell on its availability, because nothing worked without it. But here, in this quiet space between your waking hours and your dreams, nothing must flow. Nothing must happen. Nothing is required of you. Here, you can be still. Here, you can rest. Here, the only tide is the tide of sleep, pulling you gently toward dreams. Paul Atreides walked into the desert and disappeared. But you don't have to disappear. You just have to rest. You just have to let go for a little while of everything you're holding. The story will be here when you wake. The questions will be here. The weight of the world will be here waiting to be picked up again. But not yet, not now. Now is for rest. Now is for the heavy, gentle, inevitable pull of sleep. Let your thoughts settle like sand after a storm. Let your breath slow. Let your body remember that it knows how to rest, even when your mind has forgotten. You've carried so much today. You've been so many things to so many people. But right now, in this darkness, you don't have to be anything. You don't have to carry anything. You can set it all down here in the quiet and let the weight of sleep take you. Good night, my dear. The desert is vast and silent. The stars are bright and far away. And you are safe here in this small room with my voice and the darkness and the slow, settling weight of dreams. Sleep well. The sand holds heat long after the sun has gone. The silence presses gently against your chest. And somewhere beyond the dunes, a figure walks alone, not lost, not searching, just walking, finally free, finally at rest. The silence of the desert is not empty. It hums with heat, with the memory of wind, with the patient waiting of sand that has been here longer than any empire. In that silence, stories grow. They take root in the spaces between words, in the gaps where certainty cannot reach. The women who planted the prophecy on Arrakis understood this. The Bene Gesserit had been weaving for centuries, threading their designs through the fabric of human civilization so carefully that no one could see the pattern. They worked in whispers, in suggestions, in the quiet education of daughters who would become mothers, who would become grandmothers, each generation carrying forward seeds they didn't know they held. My mother worked with thread sometimes, in the evenings after the sawdust was swept away. She would sit by the window with fabric in her lap, mending things that had torn, strengthening seams before they could fail. Her hands moved without her watching them, the needle finding its path through instinct and practice. I asked her once how she knew where to put the stitches. She said you learn to see where the weakness is. You learn to feel where the fabric wants to give. And then you reinforce it quietly, before anyone notices it was ever fragile. The Bene Gesserit worked like that. They found the weak places in cultures, the fears, the hopes, the longings that people couldn't articulate, and they stitched stories into those places. Stories of saviors, stories of deliverance, stories that would lie dormant for generations, waiting for the right moment to bloom. On Arrakis, the story they planted was called the Missionaria Protectiva, a fancy name for something simple: insurance. If any Bene Gesserit sister ever found herself stranded on this harsh world, the native people would already believe in a figure she could pretend to be. The prophecy was a key, hidden in plain sight, waiting for a lock that might never need opening. But Paul was not a Bene Gesserit sister. He was something they hadn't planned for, something that had slipped through their careful designs like water through fingers. His mother had been supposed to bear a daughter, another link in their breeding program, another thread in their centuries-long tapestry. Instead, she bore a son. Out of love, she said. Out of defiance. Out of something the Bene Gesserit couldn't control, no matter how carefully they planned. And that son walked into the desert carrying gifts they had given him, the training, the awareness, the voice that could command, but using those gifts for purposes they hadn't chosen. The key they had hidden on Arrakis fit a lock they never meant to open. And when it turned, the door that swung wide led somewhere they couldn't follow. There's something unsettling about discovering that your beliefs were placed in you by someone else. Something that shakes the ground beneath your feet. The Fremen believed in their Messiah the way you believe the sun will rise. It wasn't faith in the sense of hoping for something uncertain. It was knowledge. It was the air they breathed, the water they hoarded, the rhythm of their days. The listen Al Gabe would come. He would lead them to paradise. This was simply true. And it was true because generations of grandmothers had said so. Because the words had been repeated until they wore grooves in the mind, until questioning them felt like questioning whether sand was dry or stars were distant. The Bene Gesserit had planted well. They had planted deep. But does it matter where a belief comes from if the belief itself transforms you? The Fremen's faith made them strong. It gave them hope in a world that offered little. It bound them together, tribe to tribe, generation to generation. A shared story that made them more than scattered survivors in an unforgiving land. Paul saw the machinery behind the faith. He saw the stitches, the seams, the places where the fabric had been carefully reinforced. And he could have exposed it. He could have told the Fremen that their prophecy was a tool planted by off-world women for off-world purposes. But what would that have accomplished? The faith was real now, whatever its origins. The hope was real. The community built around that hope was real. Tearing it down would not free the Fremen. It would only leave them with rubble where a cathedral had stood. So Paul stepped into the role. Not because he believed he was the Messiah he knew too much for belief, but because the role was the only shape that fit the moment. The only way forward that didn't lead immediately to destruction. He wore the prophecy like armor, was not made for him, knowing it would chafe and bind, and eventually, perhaps, crush him. My father painted a picture once of a man wearing a mask. The mask was beautiful golden, serene, perfectly crafted. But if you looked closely, you could see the straps cutting into the skin behind the ears. You could see the tension in the jaw, the effort of holding the face still beneath the stillness of the mask. He never sold that painting. He said it was too honest. He said people don't want to see the straps. They want to believe the serenity is real. Paul's serenity was not real. Beneath the stillness of the Messiah, beneath the golden mask of Muad'Dib, there was a young man who had lost his father, lost his home, lost any hope of an ordinary life. There was someone who woke in the night from visions of blood, who saw the faces of people not yet dead, who knew that his every choice was a thread in a tapestry of violence he couldn't unweave. The Fremen saw the mask. They needed to see the mask. And Paul held it in place, day after day, year after year, the straps cutting deeper, the effort growing greater, until he couldn't remember what his own face felt like underneath. Charisma is a strange thing. We speak of it as though it belongs to the person who has it, a gift, a talent, something they carry within them. But charisma lives in the space between people. It's not something you have. It's something that happens when others look at you and see what they need to see. Paul was charismatic because the Fremen needed a charismatic leader, because their hope had been shaped over generations to recognize a certain kind of figure, because the prophecy had prepared them to fall in love with exactly the qualities Paul possessed. His strangeness became mystery. His knowledge became wisdom. His suffering became sacrifice. He didn't create this. He couldn't have. Charisma cannot be manufactured by the person who seems to possess it. It can only be manufactured by the audience, by the believers, by the ones who need so badly to believe that they build a pedestal and place you on it before you can object. The Bene Gesserit understood this. They had been shaping audiences for centuries. They knew that a Messiah is not born, a Messiah is recognized. And recognition can be engineered. You simply plant the template deep enough, early enough, and then wait for someone to fit it. Paul fit. Not perfectly. He was not what they had planned, but close enough. Close enough for the Fremen to see their listen algabe. Close enough for the template to activate, for the recognition to ignite, for the wildfire of belief to catch and spread. And once it caught, there was no stopping it. You cannot argue with a wildfire. You cannot reason with it negotiate with it, ask it politely to burn in a different direction. You can only run before it, or ride it, or be consumed. Paul chose to ride. The desert at night is cold. The same sand that burns under the noon sun releases its heat into the darkness, and the temperature drops until your breath fogs and your fingers ache. The Fremen knew how to survive this, how to wrap themselves in stillsuits and cloaks, how to find shelter in the rocks, how to wait for dawn. Paul learned to wait too. He learned that some things cannot be rushed, that the desert has its own rhythm, and fighting it only exhausts you. That patience is not passive. It is the most active form of strength, the decision to endure rather than to break. His visions showed him futures branching like the roots of a great tree, spreading in every direction, tangling and diverging and reconverging in patterns too complex to fully grasp. He could see where certain choices led. He could see the deaths that followed certain paths, the lives that might be spared on others. But he could not see everything. The future was not a single road, but a wilderness. And even with his prescient sight, he was still a man walking through it, one step at a time. The weight of that knowledge pressed on him constantly. Every decision carried the shadow of its consequences. Every word he spoke rippled outward into possibilities he could partially see, partially guess, never fully control. He was not a god, though the Fremen treated him as one. He was a man with a window into tomorrow, and the window showed him mostly fire. There's a kind of loneliness that comes from seeing what others cannot see. The loneliness of the prophet, the visionary, the one who knows what's coming and cannot make anyone understand. Cassandra knew this loneliness. In the old Greek stories, she was given the gift of prophecy and the curse of disbelief. She saw Troy burning before the first flame was lit. She warned, and no one listened. And when the fire finally came, she burned with the rest of them, her knowledge useless, her warnings unheard. Paul's curse was different. People believed him too much, too completely, too fervently. They hung on his words. They shaped their lives around his visions. They went to war in his name, died in his name, killed in his name. He was not disbelieved. He was believed so thoroughly that his beliefs became a weapon he couldn't shoot. The loneliness of being believed is its own kind of isolation. When everyone looks at you and sees a Messiah, no one sees you. When every word you speak is treated as prophecy, you lose the freedom to speak casually, to wonder aloud, to be uncertain. You become a symbol, and symbols don't get to have bad days. Symbols don't get to doubt. Symbols don't get to sit quietly by a window and watch the rain and feel for a moment like just another person in a world full of people. Chani saw him. That was her gift to him, the gift of being seen. In her eyes, he was still Paul, still the boy who had stumbled into the desert, still the young man who reached for her in the darkness, still someone who could be held and comforted and loved without worship. But even Chani couldn't fully reach him. The visions built walls between Paul and everyone else, walls made of knowledge, walls made of time. He lived partly in the present and partly in futures that hadn't happened yet, and that divided existence made true intimacy almost impossible. How do you share a moment with someone when you've already seen how the moment ends? How do you lose yourself in joy when you know what sorrows are approaching? The spice was the key to everything. The substance that made Paul's visions possible, that made space travel possible, that made the entire galactic economy turn. It existed only on Arrakis, produced only by the sandworms, precious beyond measure. Whoever controlled the spice controlled the universe. This was not metaphor. This was simple fact. Without the spice, the ships couldn't navigate. Without the ships, the planets couldn't trade. Without trade, civilization collapsed. The spice must flow, they said, and they meant it literally. The spice was the blood of the empire, and Arrakis was its beating heart. Paul understood this leverage. He understood that the Fremen, dismissed as savages by the great powers, actually held the most valuable resource in existence. He understood that their control of the desert was control of the spice, and control of the spice was control of everything. This was power, real power, not the power of armies or titles, but the power of necessity, the power of being needed so badly that no one could afford to destroy you. But power is heavy. It presses down on the one who holds it. It demands to be used, to be protected, to be fed. And the more power you accumulate, the more you become a target, the more you must defend, the more you must sacrifice to keep what you've gained. Paul gained an empire. He sacrificed his peace. The throne room was vast and cold. After the battles were won, after the old emperor was deposed, after Paul claimed his place as ruler of the known universe, he sat on a throne that had been built for someone else. The proportions were wrong. The style was foreign. It had been designed to make the old emperor look powerful, and it made Paul look small. He could have built a new throne. He could have remade the palace in his own image, but there was something fitting about the ill-fitting seat, something honest about the discomfort. He had not wanted this. He had not chosen this. He was sitting in someone else's chair, playing someone else's role, wearing someone else's crown. Irulan moved through the palace like a ghost. She had been part of the price of victory, the old emperor's daughter, married to the new emperor, a living symbol of continuity and legitimacy. She had her own rooms, her own servants, her own carefully circumscribed life. She and Paul rarely spoke. When they did, the words were formal, careful, empty of anything that mattered. She wrote about him constantly. Histories, biographies, analyses of his rise to power. She studied him the way a scholar studies a text, looking for meaning, looking for patterns, looking for the man beneath the myth. But the man kept receding. The more she wrote, the less she understood. The words piled up like sand, and Paul remained as distant as the horizon. I think about Irulan with a kind of aching recognition. The loneliness of living beside someone you cannot reach. The loneliness of filling pages with words that never quite capture what you're trying to say. She was trapped in a story she hadn't written, playing a role she hadn't chosen, and the only freedom she had was the freedom to document her captivity. The Jihad spread across the stars. Fremen warriors, hardened by the desert, carried Paul's name to worlds that had never heard of Arrakis. They conquered in his name. They killed in his name. They believed, with the absolute conviction of the faithful, that they were bringing salvation. 61 billion dead. That was the number Paul saw in his visions. 61 billion lives ended by the holy war that bore his name. Worlds burned, civilizations erased, cultures that had existed for millennia wiped away in a generation. He had tried to prevent it. In the early days, when the paths were still branching, he had searched desperately for a future without this violence. But every path that avoided the Jihad led somewhere worse. Every door that didn't open onto war opened onto extinction. The violence was not the worst option. It was the least terrible option. And that knowledge was its own kind of horror. How do you live with that? How do you wake each morning knowing that billions are dying because of you, and that the alternative was billions more? How do you eat breakfast, attend meetings, make small talk, when the weight of 61 billion ghosts presses down on your shoulders? Paul lived with it, the way the desert lives with heat. He absorbed it. He let it become part of him. He stopped fighting the weight and learned to carry it, one day at a time, one breath at a time, one step at a time through the endless sand. The years passed. The Jihad burned itself out, as all fires eventually do. The empire stabilized. The spice flowed. Paul ruled, and the universe turned around him like a wheel around its axle. But he was tired, so tired. The visions never stopped. The weight never lifted. The mask never came off. He was Muad'Dib, the Messiah, the Emperor, the one who had seen too much and could never unsee it. And beneath all those titles, beneath all those roles, there was still a young man who had lost his father in the desert, who had never had the chance to grieve properly, who had never had the chance to be ordinary. Chani gave him children, twins, born in the midst of crisis, arriving as Paul's world contracted around him. He held them once, these small lives that carried his blood and his burden, and he wondered what futures they would inherit, what visions they might see, what weights they would carry. He didn't get to watch them grow. The desert was calling him. The same desert that had made him was now asking for him back. When Paul walked into the sand for the last time, he was blind. A weapon had taken his eyes, but he had continued to see through prescience, navigating by visions of the future rather than light from the present. It was a strange way to live, always looking ahead, never quite inhabiting the moment. But the prescience was fading. The futures were growing dim. The window that had shown him so much was slowly closing, and soon he would be truly blind, unable to see either present or future. The Fremen had a tradition for those who lost their sight. They walked into the desert alone. They gave themselves back to the sand that had shaped them. It was not suicide, it was completion, a return to the source, a final surrender to the current that had carried them all their lives. Paul followed this tradition. He said goodbye to no one. He left no instructions, no final words, no dramatic farewell. He simply walked out of the palace, out of the city, out of the life he had never chosen, and into the endless, patient, waiting sand. The desert took him. The desert that had made him a Messiah, that had given him power and purpose and pain, that had demanded everything and offered nothing but itself. The desert took him back, and he disappeared into it like a drop of water into an ocean of sand. Some say he died out there. Some say the worms took him, as they take everything eventually. Some say he found an oasis, a hidden place, a refuge where he could finally rest. I like to think he found peace. I like to think the desert, which had been so harsh, so demanding, so unforgiving, finally showed him its gentler face. The face it shows at dawn, when the light is soft and the heat has not yet risen. The face it shows at night, when the stars are bright and the silence feels like a blessing rather than a burden. I like to think he walked until he couldn't walk anymore, and then he lay down in the sand, and the sand was warm, and the sky was vast, and for the first time in years, he didn't have to be anything for anyone. He could just be, just exist, just rest. The story didn't end with Paul. Stories never really end. They just change shape, pass to new hands, find new voices to carry them forward. His children grew up in his shadow. His son, Leto, would eventually take on a burden even greater than Paul's. But that's a story for another night. His daughter, Ganima, would carry her own weight, make her own choices, find her own way through the wilderness of the future. The Fremen remembered him. They told stories about Muad'Dib around their fires, in their sieges, in the quiet hours when the desert was still. The stories grew and changed as stories do. They became legend, then myth, then something close to scripture. And the prophecy that had been planted so long ago, the seed that the Bene Gesserit had buried in Fremen soil, continued to bloom in ways no one had predicted. It had taken root too deeply to be pulled out. It had become part of the landscape, part of the culture, part of the way the Fremen understood themselves and their world. Was that a tragedy? A triumph? Both? Neither? I don't know. I don't think anyone knows. The story is too big for simple judgments, too complex for easy morals. It simply is, the way the desert simply is, vast and ancient and indifferent to our need for meaning. The night has grown very deep now. I've been speaking for a long time, and my voice is growing soft, and the silence between my words is growing longer. That's all right. The silence is part of the story too. The pauses, the breaths, the moments when words aren't needed. The desert knows the value of silence. The Fremen knew it. Paul knew it in the end when he walked away from everything and let the quiet take him. You've been so patient, listening to all of this, letting the weight of it settle over you, letting the story carry you the way the tide carries a swimmer who has stopped fighting. I hope you're resting now. I hope your eyes are closed or closing. I hope your breath has slowed, your muscles have softened, your mind has quieted. The story will be here when you wake. Paul and Chani and the endless sand. The prophecy and the Jihad and the terrible weight of being believed in. It will all be here, waiting, patient as the desert. But you don't have to carry any of it right now. You don't have to understand it or judge it or make sense of it. You can just let it be. Let it exist in the back of your mind like a landscape you visited, a place you know is there even when you're not looking at it. The spice must flow, they said. But here, nothing must flow. Here, everything can be still. The sand holds heat long after the sun has gone. But here, you can be cool. Here, you can be comfortable. Here, the only warmth is the warmth of rest, the warmth of safety, the warmth of knowing you are exactly where you need to be. Paul walked into the desert and found peace. And you, my dear, can find peace too. Not in the desert, but here, in this moment, in this breath, in the gentle, heavy, inevitable pull of sleep. Good night. The stars are bright and far away. The silence presses gently against your chest. And somewhere beyond the dunes, beyond the stories, beyond the weight of prophecy and power, there is rest. There is always rest, waiting for those who are ready to receive it. You are ready. You are safe. You are home. Sleep well, my dear. Sleep well.